All right, so I'm not going to lie, this one is a little bit weird, but it's also pretty cool. So I'm really hoping we can strike that balance here today. I am still reading through this book, Echoes of Exodus by Alastair J. Roberts and Andrew Wilson. Talked about it in last week's episode a little bit, and really just enjoying it. There's like every single page has something I'm like, what? That's an amazing connection. I'm really excited about it. Essentially, this book goes through different portions of the Bible that follow the pattern of the Exodus story to show that there's consistency throughout Scripture, to show that there's these echoes that kind of increase in volume as the Bible kind of progresses, and then there's fulfillment in the person of Jesus Christ. And there are some places where I feel this pattern happen very naturally. I hear it for myself. There are even times like Paul in the New Testament ends up explaining this very explicitly, that the journey from our old sinful life through the waters of baptism and then into the land where God dwells with us, that's very much the Exodus story, but he's using it in a new spiritual way to talk about the process of conversion and those Christians in the church in the first century. Also for us today, I mean, we read those words today and resonate with them. There's another place that I've learned about within like the last year or two that's really interesting. It's in Genesis 12, verses 10 through 20, and it follows the exact same pattern. Abraham goes into Egypt because of famine, just like Israel ends up going into Egypt because of famine. You remember the Joseph story. Pharaoh takes the wife of Abraham as his own possession, just like Pharaoh takes the Israelites as slaves in Egypt. Plagues follow, and then Abraham brings his wife back out of Egypt, just like Moses does with the nation of Israel. So really interesting there that just in a short section, you have the entire Exodus narrative kind of replayed in the life of Abraham. So I've seen some of these, I've learned some of these. There's some portions of this book that I had never thought of before. And that's what I want to go over today, something I had never, ever heard before that I think is really fascinating when we overlay this Exodus pattern on top of this other biblical story. And that is the story of Jacob and Rachel. And when we do this, when we lay this Exodus pattern over top of this other story, a couple of really cool things happen. For one, it makes sense of a really odd section of Scripture that's not really elaborated on. Throughout this story of Jacob marrying Rachel and bringing her back home, we get this one piece of information in there that is not explained at all. It's just stated that it happens. And it's really confusing. It's a little bit weird, and people draw their own conclusions based on it. But when we overlay this pattern, it actually might make sense of what's going on a little bit more clearly. It also shows God's consistency in working similar ways throughout time, which I find helpful because I start to notice it in my own life as well. As Paul points out to the Corinthians, there is a spiritual aspect to this that we all kind of walk through in Exodus of being slaves to sin and then bondservants to Christ as he leads us towards himself. And then also, kind of the third goal of this episode that I'm hoping this kind of brings out is that hopefully this shows an attempt by God to connect with women in a place that they probably, or I'll say typically, feel very isolated. And that is through a woman's period or menstrual cycle. I realize that is so strange. Probably not even my place to necessarily talk about it because I'm not a woman and I've never dealt with that. But I do have a lot of people talking to me about it in general. I have a lot of female friends. My girlfriend talks to me about this, and it's just like there is a lot to be said about this. I mean, the Bible actually talks a lot about menstruation and periods, and I realize I'm not going to get too graphic with this by any means, and I realize it's a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, but we're just going to kind of bite the bullet, get through it anyways, because I do think we'll see an interesting time where God might actually be trying to show some solidarity with women in this place. I realize that's going to get some people's hackles up. Stay with me. I promise by the end of this, it'll make sense, and it's not going to be some inflammatory thing. This isn't clickbait. This isn't, just some thing to kind of like rile people up. This is just a rational look at a story with the Exodus story overlaid on top of it, but there is this weird portion in the middle of the story that has to do with periods, so we're going to have to kind of walk through that a little bit. So in this story, you have Jacob. He leaves the promised land of Canaan and goes back to Haran, which is a foreign land. It's up past the northern part of Israel, and it is actually a place where Abraham journeyed after he left his homeland. And so Jacob has some family up in this area. So it's a foreign land, meaning it's not the promised land, but it's not somewhere he's entirely unfamiliar with. But the important part is that he leaves the promised land to go to a foreign land, just like the Israelites will leave the promised land to go into Egypt. That is a very common thing. What's interesting, too, is if you look at a map, Israel's kind of in the middle. Haran is like up. I'm trying to think of it from your perspective. It's up and to the right, but it'll probably be this way on the camera. I'm not sure. But it's up and to the right, so like northeast, and Egypt is kind of southwest. So it's almost like they start here, and then both people, whether you're looking at the nation of Israel or Jacob, who is the namesake of that nation, in their Exodus journeys, they leave the promised land, go here, and then eventually come back together. So it's almost like bookends or like symmetrical Exodus journeys, which is kind of neat. That's just like geographically, though, so not terribly important. The important part is that they do both leave the promised land to go into a foreign land. Now, after this, Jacob enters into the service of Laban, who throughout this story will play the role of Pharaoh. Now, even if you're not terribly familiar with how this story goes, Laban is someone we recognize as kind of not the best guy. He doesn't have a good name that follows him throughout history, and that makes sense with him taking on this Pharaoh role. But Jacob enters into Laban's service, and Laban throughout this story manipulates and mistreats Jacob by tricking him into marrying Leah, his oldest daughter, and tricking him into performing more and more work. And he's also horrible to his own daughters, making Leah enter into a loveless marriage and not giving Rachel the marriage that she desires. So this happens where Jacob is kind of mistreated in this service, and that kind of harkens back to Israel being in hard service under Pharaoh in Egypt. Jacob, Leah, and Rachel grow a large family and are blessed by God, just like the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied in the land of Egypt, which actually ended up kind of tightening the grip of Pharaoh on them ultimately. So they're very blessed by God with a large family, lots of livestock. And Jacob, after growing his family and his possessions, requests that he be allowed to take his family out of Laban's service after he's married the daughters and kind of gained property and gained livestock. He's like, I need to go back home. I need to go back to the land that God promised my ancestors. And he actually ends up separating from Laban a bit, 3 days journey away from him, just like Moses requests the Pharaoh, please let us go 3 days into the wilderness and worship our God there. So this kind of ends up happening for Jacob, where he separates from Laban, just a 3 days journey. So he's not free to go yet, but he does get this 3 days distance like Moses was requesting from Pharaoh. Then Jacob and his family are met with contempt, not only by Laban, but also by Laban's sons, who envy the blessings from God and his provision of fruitfulness to Jacob's family. They kind of mutter against him. And just like the Egyptians hated the Israelites who were growing and multiplying. So this further made their service like that much a tighter yoke around their necks. Later, Laban attempts to further manipulate Jacob, but ends up looking foolish. He ends up manipulating him into further work and everything, but Jacob only continually gets blessed with more and more children, more and more blessings from God, more and more livestock. His flocks are just like, healthy and good and growing and prospering. So even in trying to hold Jacob underneath his thumb, Laban ends up looking a little dumb because God blesses Jacob through all of this. Then, because of this hard service and this kind of fear that Laban's never really going to let them go, Jacob takes his family and his wealth that he's gained from Laban, and he flees, just like the Israelites plunder the Egyptians and flee away. Now, Pharaoh eventually did give permission, so there is a little bit of a difference there. But you'll notice what Laban does next, it's not to say that Jacob wasn't technically free to go. It's that Jacob was hoping to preserve some sort of goodwill between the two parties. And so it's like he could have gone, but there's definitely some like, how much are you really in charge of me going on here? But eventually Jacob does flee into the wilderness, and Laban gives chase, just like Pharaoh did to Israel. He chases after him, like trying to reclaim him. Now, so throughout this, I think I've done an okay job at establishing that there are so many connections between the Exodus story and the pattern seen there of Israel from Egypt, and also Jacob's exodus away from Laban. But towards the end of this story, we are given this really odd piece of information regarding Rachel, and it is that she steals the household gods. And I want to be very clear here, because so often when we see or hear this being talked about, people will say, well, Rachel stole the gods for this reason. We want to attribute motive, but the Bible very clearly never puts motive on Rachel. It just says that she stole them, and that Laban's not happy about it. He knows they're gone. He notices they're missing, and he gives chase after Jacob and his caravan of flocks and family. So we don't know why Rachel did this. We need to be very, very clear on that. That's going to kind of open up the door for a possible reason why she did in just a minute. But Laban is really angry that his household gods are gone, his idols, the things that would have been on an altar in a small place in his home or something. So he's angry, and he pursues Jacob, and he accuses him of theft and treachery. Like, why did you sneak away from me? I thought we were family. I thought, just really trying to be manipulative still, trying to guilt him into thinking he did wrong. But Jacob is pretty firm. He's like, no, we're leaving. This is done. We're done here. You are not oppressing us anymore. And Laban seeks for the household gods in all of Jacob's possessions. But when he gets to Rachel and her possessions, Rachel explains, well, I can't get up off the camel right now because I'm on my period. I'm going through my menstrual cycle. I'm in my uncleanness, and so you have to stay away from me. And the crazy part is, she is sitting on the very household gods that Laban is looking for. She's sitting on them while she's going through her period. Now, many want to say that Rachel's being faithless here. She took these idols to protect her and her family, or she was just, going back to her roots. She did kind of like a Lot's wife moment where she looked back and kind of yearned for the pagan traditions of her family. Many want to attribute this motive to her. But up until this point, we have a little bit of bickering between Rachel and Leah going on, but we don't quite see faithlessness from Rachel. She's still very much attributing the birth of her son Joseph to God. She's still praying to God, seeking fruitfulness of her womb in her relationship with Jacob. So I'm not saying she's a perfect moral character, but we don't see her like petitioning pagan gods. And then all of a sudden, we see her stealing the idols from Laban's house. And we want to say, well, that's just because she's always been that way. And it's true. Maybe this was her custom in the land she grew up. That's very possible. But why this weird action by Rachel? Like it doesn't give a motive. And so why do we feel that we can attribute one to her and say, well, this is like a moral lapse in Rachel's character. She's not trusting in God. We just kind of add that to the text. So much so that even when I brought this up to a few people, they're like, oh, well, she was like wrong in doing that. It's like, it doesn't say that. Now, idolatry is wrong. But again, we're adding motive that's not there. And I think if we strip our bias away from that, we leave room for there to be a possibility that Rachel was actually doing kind of a cool thing here. But why this action by Rachel? Why mention her period? Why even add this to the story at all? Well, if we look at this story through the lens of the Exodus, I think we might see something that fits the pattern even better than Rachel just desiring idols or desiring pagan god worship or something. The Exodus story, we'll have to remember, is no less than God reclaiming his bride from the hands of oppressors and captors by doing what? By humiliating the gods of the land and showing his dominance over the gods of the land. In the same way, this part of the story fits right in line with it being possible that Rachel is doing something very similar to what God did in the Exodus story. She is bleeding on the idols of her abusive father. And as she does this, she shames the gods that he worships in one last act of defiance and victory for the one true God. She ends up kind of weaponizing a natural process to wage war on pagan gods and her oppressive father, just like God did with the plagues of Egypt. I mean, he used things like boils and hail and darkness, all natural things, but used in the hands of God in miraculous ways to show his dominance over the other gods. And in this way, Rachel's using something natural to perhaps do a very similar thing. Now, what's so cool about this, if you're resonating with this, if you feel like that actually makes a lot of sense, I think this kind of makes the most sense, has the most explanatory power of this bizarre section we read about. But what's so cool about this is if this is true, it's essentially God saying, through the inspiration of Scripture, that he is relating what he did with the plagues of Egypt to what Rachel did with her period. Now, this isn't to say that God has a period. That's not what I'm saying before liberal Christians start applauding me and conservative Christians start seeking to stone me. But it could be saying that God is relating to that experience and even granting it some dignity. And I think this is great because I know several women who struggle with the idea of experiencing this pain every single month. They don't understand what purpose it serves, and they can tend to feel singled out by God, as if this is punishment from him just for existing as a woman, which they didn't even choose themselves. God created them. God made them. They're like this, and now they're being punished for it. That's kind of the feeling that a lot of women have. Now, not every woman. Some people are able to reconcile this, and even the ones that can't, I have only ever known Christian women who can't reconcile this to still be trusting in God. So it's not to say this hinders their faith at all. In some ways, it provides a catalyst for faith to take shape and take form. So I'm not trying to denigrate the women who struggle against this idea, but it is a struggle, and I don't want to minimize that either. Then you add in the laws of Leviticus, which show that this is uncleanness, which they also didn't choose. If your period extends past a normal amount of time, you have to make sacrifices to kind of get right with God again. Now, in context, I don't think these things are anti-woman, and I think they serve a purpose, and I do trust God in that, he handed down these laws and that they make sense, even if they don't make sense to me in a given moment. But in the extreme guilt culture that we find ourselves living in right now, it is frequent that I hear that women feel this way, wrestling with the idea that somehow they are less for experiencing something that God created in them. Now, this story doesn't remove that struggle necessarily, but it could act as evidence that God does not see it as inherently less, that he actually relates to it, and that Rachel isn't some idolatrous woman clinging to evil, but actually she's kind of a hero standing in solidarity with God by shaming the pagan gods of her evil father, just as she has escaped from them. And I think that is a wild theory in some ways, but it is also such an amazing thing because this puts Rachel in the position of filling a spot that God fills in another story. And we see this all the time where God works through certain people to perform actions that he will later do or that he's already done, to say, you are kind of in place of me in this story. Not to say you are like God on earth. This isn't like a Pope thing or something, but to say in this narrative, you fill this spot in the pattern. And we see this with men all throughout the Bible. And I do think we see this with women as well. But this is an awesome moment of that happening, where it not only elevates the dignity of a woman going through normal things that are natural to her body, but it also elevates Rachel as kind of a heroine of the scriptures, doing something that God did in Egypt, now with the pagan gods of her father Laban. And that, I will admit, is super weird, but it is also really cool.